This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Alex Ritson, and in the early hours of Thursday, the 29th of November, these are our main stories. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warned senators against downgrading relations with Saudi Arabia over the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Britain's government admits Brexit will make the UK poorer. A Chinese court sentences a male prostitute to a year in prison for knowingly infecting his sexual partners with HIV. Also in this podcast, why warming seas are bad news for oyster lovers.
For one species in particular, we found clear sort of reductions in proteins and lipids and carbohydrates.
Ever since Saudi Arabia acknowledged the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi in its consulate in Istanbul, there have been calls from Congress for a strong response from the United States. Now, senior members of President Donald Trump's cabinet have been giving a closed-door briefing to the Senate in Washington. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo told reporters that downgrading US-Saudi ties could damage the chances of a ceasefire in Yemen.
We made clear that they're considering debating a resolution on the Senate floor, which we think is just poorly timed. We are on the cusp of allowing the U.S. envoy Martin Griffiths to, in December, gather the parties together and hopefully get a ceasefire in Yemen, something that we have diplomatically been striving for months.
Our correspondent in Washington, Barbara Plett-Usher, told me more about the briefing.
So this briefing was about Yemen, and it was about Saudi Arabia, the war in Yemen in particular, because Congress has been agitating against it. They're uneasy about the U.S. support for it. But that has become more of an issue because of anger over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And what we've got now is a resolution, or there's going to be a vote in the coming days about whether to end U.S. support for this Saudi-led war. So that's what Mr. Pompeo was immediately responding to. He was trying to head that off, and you heard him there talking about how this is a bad time to pull back U.S. support for Saudi Arabia, given there's this fragile peace process, it's gaining momentum, and we don't want to upset that. But more broadly, he also argued about the relationship with Saudi Arabia, because there's anger and outrage over that in the Senate, given the alleged role of the Crown Prince. And he said, look, Saudi Arabia has its faults, but it's a stable and strategic ally, and it's not nearly as bad as Iran. We need it in order to fight terrorism and to counter Iran. So downgrading relations at this point would undermine our influence there, and it would negatively impact our national security. That was the broad gist of the arguments.
So Mike Pompeo's views very much in line with those of Donald Trump. What did the Senate make of that?
Well, those senators who spoke out after the briefing were quite skeptical. I think I would summarize, in terms of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, broadly speaking, the response was, look, Saudi Arabia is an ally. We have a strategic relationship, yes, but this Crown Prince seems to be out of control, and we have to flag that up in some way with a tougher response. Otherwise, we're sending a message of impunity. Things just cannot be business as usual. That was the broad response, I think. And then also with regards to the war in Yemen, the senators who are sponsoring the resolution say they have picked up support since they tried previously to get it passed. So there's still the question about whether the Senate will vote against the war. And
in a few seconds, Barbara, anger that the CIA director Gina Haspel was absent.
Yes, very much so. They wanted to hear directly from the CIA whether the intelligence assessment was indeed that Mohammed bin Salman had ordered the killing. You heard the Secretary of State saying that there was no direct reporting, but they were very upset, the senators, that they couldn't hear that from the CIA itself.
Barbara Plett-Usher in Washington. To London now, and the continuing saga of Brexit.
Can we be clear about something first of all? That compared to the status quo of where we are at the moment inside the EU, is every scenario under which we leave likely to be detrimental to GDP?
Yes, you're right in that analysis. If you look at this purely from an economic point of view, there will be a cost to leaving the European Union because there will be impediments to our trade.
We will be poorer.
The economy will be slightly smaller in the Prime Minister's preferred version of the future partnership.
That's Britain's Chancellor or Finance Minister Philip Hammond admitting that whatever option is taken, the country will be worse off financially after leaving the European Union. A few hours later, it was the turn of Mark Carney, head of the Bank of England, to warn that a disorderly Brexit would cause bigger economic problems than any since the Second World War.
Our job is not to hope for the best, but to prepare for the worst. And we have looked at a potential no deal, no transition Brexit and made a series of worst case assumptions around that. By the end of 2023, GDP is more than 10% lower in the disorderly scenario compared to that May 2016 trend. The sharp fall in sterling, alongside with the imposition of tariffs, pushes up the cost of imports, and overall CPI inflation peaks at 6.6%.
Even our political correspondent, Rob Watson, seemed surprised by the latest turn of events.
If you think about it, Mrs May has begun this big sell of her big Brexit deal, and I would say it is in big, big trouble because I've reported on British politics on and off for 30-odd years, and in fact the democratic politics of other countries, I've never heard of a leader trying to win a vote in Parliament by saying, vote for my deal, the country is going to be worse off. I mean, this is almost surreal.
It does make it into an incredibly hard sell also to the British Parliament who are due to vote on this.
Absolutely, very much so. I mean, I think MPs who were on the Remain side are going to find this really, really difficult. I mean, of course, those who are on the Brexit side are saying, oh, you know, this is more project fear, this is hysteria. I think the problem they have, though, is that since the referendum, yes, there hasn't been the kind of car crash that was predicted before the referendum, but the British economy has got weaker. The pound has gone down, business investment has plummeted, business confidence is down. So the only way, I guess, in which this dreadful economic forecasts help the Prime Minister is in this way, and that is she could turn around and say, well, at least my deal isn't as bad as no deal, but that's a pretty poor tour of persuasion.
So, Rob, where does this leave her? What happens next?
If you think about it, Theresa May has been on this big sell, and on Monday she had an absolute pummelling in Parliament. Tuesday, the problem with Donald Trump saying that Britain wouldn't get a good free trade deal, and now this. I mean, I think the question is now changing at Westminster, and that is not, you know, can she win the big vote on December the 11th? But I think this makes it now more. The question is, what's going to happen when she loses? I mean, I think we've got to that point, and I think the answer to that is, you know, we are in profoundly uncharted territory.
Rob Watson. An appeals court in Greece has suspended a controversial 10-year sentence imposed on a nursery school cleaner, which sparked widespread public outrage. Her conviction will now be reviewed by the Supreme Court. With more details, here's Danny Aberhart.
The 53-year-old cleaner had worked at the nursery school for 15 years before her deception was revealed. She'd claimed to have completed the required 6 years of primary education when she'd actually dropped out after 5. But her sentence, originally 15 years then reduced to 10, was decried as draconian. One Greek human rights group called it inhuman. Many people compared it with the justice system's perceived lenient treatment of corrupt politicians or convicted terrorists. The cleaner has been released on humanitarian grounds, but she's not been cleared.
Danny Aberhart. Social media users in China have been venting their fury about what they feel was a far too light prison sentence for a man who, despite knowing he had HIV, continued selling sex in Beijing. The man, only known as Yu, was sentenced to 1 year in prison for spreading sexually transmitted diseases. Kerry Allen is our China media analyst.
Well, this man was a male prostitute and he had HIV and he'd not disclosed this, and he continued being a male prostitute selling sex, and this was discovered in May earlier this year, and he was arrested, and the case has only just gone to court recently, and he's been given a year-long sentence. Beyond that, we don't know many details about him. We know that his surname is Yu, but they say that there are personal privacy issues involved with this, and they can't release many details about this case.
And this has caused some outrage, not least because only a week ago we talked about another case in which a woman was sentenced to 10 years in prison for writing a book about gay sex.
Yes, this woman had written this erotic novel and media took a very, very firm stance on her. Social media users said that the case was almost served to discourage people from writing anything, really. And people today are talking about this man They were saying that he should have been prosecuted for murder rather than spreading sexually transmitted diseases. So there's a lot of anger about this, that he's received a year sentence and a 5,000 UN fine, which is the equivalent of about £500 or $700. So they're saying that they think that China's judiciary system needs to review some of these cases and introduce fiercer punishment.
Does the fact that he's a man and she's a woman play into this at all?
It possibly does, yes. In China in general, there's more of an acceptance of gay culture for men because of China's gender imbalance. There are millions more men than there are women in the country. So if straight men want to meet partners, they're going to struggle because there's way fewer women. But if women are gay, this is an issue because through a kind of male-dominated society, there's the difficulty that there's even fewer women, basically. You know, that's the mentality. So yeah, it's entirely possible that because this woman had been writing this novel called Occupation that got a lot of people, you know, they were really interested in this. They thought it was exciting, this book. The government saw this as almost encouraging gay culture. It's entirely possible that she received a strict sentence because she was a woman, whereas media have been more open to stories about homosexuality with men.
Kerry Allen. Now, if you love oysters, I'm afraid we have some bad news for you and for them too. New research from scientists here in the UK has found our warming world is affecting the molluscs' nutritional values and their abilities to survive. Dr. Anel Lamarson led the study.
For one species in particular, the Pacific oyster, which is the one more commercially sort of popular, we found clear sort of reductions in proteins and lipids and carbohydrates. The temperature is higher and the chemistry of the water is changing. For some of those species, it can be more difficult to sort of do everyday process, such as breathing and eating. And this is potentially quite important, both in terms of ecological aspects, but also for aquaculture. It is concerning that some species can be affected, but it's very difficult to extrapolate those results to sort of seafood in general. The same sort of climate scenarios on one species of fish and on one species of marine snails found no or slight changes. The effects of those conditions can be quite varied from one species to another. This sort of field of research is quite new and developing. It would be very useful to sort of do similar experiments looking at various seafood species and try to identify perhaps species that are even more resilient and that are not going to be as impacted.
Dr. Anel Lamarson. Still to come.
There was a very strong cafe culture where it was very easy for artists or scientists or writers to overlap and discuss, and there was a culture of public discourse. It was a city of extremes. We had extreme wealth, but also abject poverty in other areas.
An exhibition of the works of Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele reflects the world of early 20th century Vienna. The Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan says all his country's political parties and institutions, including its powerful military, want to improve relations with India. He was speaking after laying a foundation stone for a new border crossing, which will make it easier for Sikh pilgrims from India to visit a holy site just inside Pakistan. But there's been a cool response to Mr. Khan's comments from the Indian Foreign Ministry, which described his comments about the disputed region of Kashmir as deeply regrettable. Musharraf Zaidi is a columnist for the News International newspaper in Pakistan and is a former advisor to the Pakistani Foreign Ministry. What does he make of it all?
Well, I think it's very significant because essentially what it establishes is both the willingness of the Pakistani state to make a concession and the possibility of how such concessions can expand the space for ordinary people to have a better life. I think the fact that Sikhs get to practice their faith more freely as a result of this initiative is a wonderful outcome for members of that community. And it's exactly the kind of example that can be used to build on bigger and better initiatives.
You say it's a concession. In what way is it a concession?
Well, it's a concession because Pakistan doesn't have to do it. There was no compelling social, political, or economic pressure on Pakistan to do this. Pakistan it has a small Sikh minority, but nowhere near the sizable Sikh minority that India has. The people that will benefit from this the most are Indian nationals. So this is virtually a gift from the Pakistani people And the fact that the government is facilitating it is a wonderful thing.
What in that case do you make of the response from the Indian Foreign Ministry that Imran Khan has been politicising this whole event, this inauguration of a new border crossing by making reference to the region of Kashmir?
Well, look, first of all, the Prime Minister of Pakistan is a politician. There's nothing wrong with a politician making political statements. Second of all, if there's anything that could have been done to avoid talk of Kashmir by a Pakistani leader, that would be in the hands of the Indian leadership. The Kashmir problem is entirely a production of the Indian state. Once the Indians stop repressing Kashmiris, Pakistan will stop talking about them.
Well, of course, India accuses Pakistan of fomenting terrorism inside its borders, but without trying to litigate the whole issue of Kashmir, how far do you think that there is any sort of move afoot, or mood indeed, in Pakistan to try and change the weather?
I think there's been a series of pretty substantial signals with demonstrated evidence. I mean, the Kartarpur corridor is the latest and most obvious one. But both Indians and Pakistanis recognize that neither country gains anything from continued conflict and tension. And I think particularly Pakistan, being the smaller country, recognizes the potential benefits of greater commercial cooperation, deeper trade linkages, and more people-to-people contacts. Normalization between the two countries is inevitable, but ultimately, in all of these cases, it's usually the bigger country that drives the process forward. It's unfortunate that in this case, it's the little country that's having to take all the initiative.
Equally, though, it's often said in Pakistan that not necessarily does the army or the security forces answer to the political leadership. How far do you think, if Imran Khan is sincere in his desire to try and resolve this decades-old conflict with India, that the security forces will have his back?
I think critics of Pakistan can't have their cake and eat it too. If Pakistan is run by the army, then clearly this corridor and the initiatives for outreach to India already have the approval of the army. I think the ultimate responsibility for responding to Pakistan is on India's shoulders.
Musharraf Zaidi speaking to my colleague Tim Franks. A British woman who got pregnant after being raped as a teenager is demanding a change in the law to prevent her attacker having any say in their child's life. Sammy Woodhouse, who's waived her right to anonymity, says social workers working for her local council approached Arshid Hussain even though he's serving a long prison sentence for raping her as a child. Here's John Donnison.
Sammy Woodhouse was a victim of one of Britain's biggest ever child grooming scandals in the town of Rotherham in the north of England. It saw hundreds of young girls sexually abused. She became pregnant and had a son after being raped by Arshid Hussain when she was 15 years old. Ms Woodhouse says Rotherham Council has contacted Hussain regarding access to her son, even though Hussain is serving a 35-year prison sentence. She said if that were to happen, it would be shocking.
He would decide where my son would live and make all the decisions, and then my son would go and visit him in prison, which is just absolutely outrageous.
Sammy Woodhouse said at one point her son had asked to be able to visit and confront Hussain in prison, but she said he had changed his mind. It's understood Hussain was approached by the council in relation to a case passing through the family courts. In a statement, a spokesperson for Rotherham Council said it was reviewing the case but could not disclose any specifics. But the council said at no stage had it been the intention to put any child at risk or to allow any convicted child sexual exploitation offender to have care of any child.
John Donnison. One of the most watched videos on the BBC News website on Wednesday was about two Swedish mothers who are encouraging people to give up flying for a year. Their social media initiative, No Fly 2019, is hoping to get 100,000 pledges and is asking those who sign up to send in their reasons for joining. Chris Ansell took their video and turned it into radio.
My name is Maja Rosén. And my name is Lotta Hammar. And I gave up flying about 10 years ago for climate reasons.
Maja and Lotta want 100,000 Swedes to pledge not to fly in 2019.
Last year, both me and Lotta, we had a newborn baby, and we were often meeting a group of other new moms. When people spoke about their air traveling, I was thinking that I should say something, but I didn't want to destroy the atmosphere.
Globally, more than 4 billion people flew last year. This number is predicted to nearly double by 2036.
Then in January, air traveling became highly debated here in Sweden. And then I thought, okay, the time is now. So we decided to start this campaign.
In April, after months of debate, Sweden introduced a new tax on aviation to limit the impact on the environment.
It's all about to change people's habits, and that's really hard.
Aviation accounts for about 3% of the total EU greenhouse gas emissions.
We get so many sort of double messages. Most people read about climate change and realize, okay, that the situation is very severe. But at the same time, everywhere around us, we see all these commercials about flying vacations.
By November, 10,000 Swedes had signed the pledge, including many Swedish celebrities. But there has been some criticism, including from Johan Norberg, a senior fellow at the libertarian US think tank, the Cato Institute. He said, even if 100,000 Swedes never fly again, aviation in Asia increased by 3 times as many passengers only yesterday.
If 100,000 people tell the world that we're not going to fly, I think that has a big impact on the people around them. Once you've taken a year off and maybe broken a habit and realized that you can actually have a good life without flying, I think everyone who does this will fly a lot less in the future.
That report put together by Chris Ansell. The work of the Austrian painters Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele used to be mainly for the connoisseurs, but more recently their popularity, both died in 1918, has increased hugely. An exhibition at the Royal Academy in London pulls together many of their finest works. This report from our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd.
Gustav Klimt is famous for his glittering golden period paintings such as the 1907 The Kiss or the spectacular Judith and the Head of Holofernes. The Royal Academy in London has brought together mainly drawings by Klimt and by the younger Egon Schiele. Curator Sarah Lee says the story starts with the movement Klimt co-founded in 1897, the Secession.
Their aim really was to provide an alternative forum for exhibiting and promoting art, set up really in opposition to the traditional academy. They mounted several radical exhibitions in the early 1900s.
The show in London doesn't include the best-known Klimt or Schiele paintings, but Sarah Lee says their drawings reveal a lot about how they worked.
Klimt's drawings, on the whole, do relate quite specifically to his easel paintings, whereas Egon Schiele, they are made as autonomous artworks in their own right.
There was an enormous amount going on at that point intellectually in Vienna. Why?
There was a very strong cafe culture where it was very easy for artists or scientists or writers to overlap and discuss, and there was a culture of public discourse. It was a city of extremes. We had extreme wealth, but also abject poverty in other areas.
Vienna at the end of the 19th century was a maelstrom of art, of music by the likes of Mahler and the psychological investigations of Freud. The exhibition in London is an introduction to an extraordinary period of European history.
Vincent Dowd with that report. The world chess champion, Norway's Magnus Carlsen, has retained his title after a series of rapid-fire wins, beating the American challenger Fabiano Caruana. The dramatic, high-stakes showdown generated plenty of suspense, with fans on the edge of their seats. Here's some of what Mr. Carlsen had to say afterwards.
Now chess is almost as big as Facebook. It's bigger than Kim Kardashian's Twitter. And it's already, let's say, $1 billion market, and it's 1 billion people market share. So it's important to offer these amazing fans something they can love and relate to.
It had even been thought that a high-speed Armageddon tiebreaker might be necessary. Our sports news correspondent Alex Capstick joined us earlier from the venue.
We didn't get to Armageddon, and that is one reason why everybody was very excited, because they thought it might happen, because these two players have been so evenly matched over 12 games of classical chess, the normal version, which had finished in draws. There wasn't a victor in any of those 12 games. That's not to say they weren't exciting. The chess aficionado said it was exciting. It's just that neither one could take advantage of the few openings that were prized open during that period. So we had this sudden death game that took place today, so there was always going to be a winner today, and it opened with these four rapid chess rounds. These were 25-minute games. You get 10 seconds added on for each move. And Magnus Carlsen, who's the number one in the world in classical chess, is also the number one in the world at rapid chess. He was the favourite, and that did show today because he held his nerve. He won the first game, which was quite long and exhausting, very tense and very dramatic. The second game was much quicker when Fabiano Caruana just gave up early on. And then the third game, when Caruana had to win to stay in the competition, that ended quite early as well, when he realised there was no chance of that happening. So Carlsen walks away with the title. Again, he is a huge name in chess and an absolutely massive name, a real star in his home country, Norway.
So where does chess stand in the world of sport?
Well, if you listen to the organisers here, it's growing rapidly. Of course, some people will argue that it's a game, it's not a sport, but not the players and the people who follow it. They'll say they keep fit, they exercise. Obviously, they've got to be mentally fit as well. And the game is really grabbed the attention because of the internet age. People tune into this on the internet, on the web, from all over the world, especially Asia, but millions are watching it. It's been streamed on all sorts of platforms. YouTube is one, and it's proving very, very popular, especially with a younger audience. So organisers are hoping and expect this game to grow and grow.
Our sports news correspondent Alex Capstick. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Alex Ritson. Until next time, goodbye.